So hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Sloan. I'm the Content and Communications Manager here at Knotch, and I'm wearing my shirt I save for special occasions. So you can say I'm pretty excited for Knotch's first ever Pride webinar, Pride and Stride. So thank you all for joining us. I'm just gonna run through some quick housekeeping items. So there's actually an audience Q&A portion during this webinar. So just make sure to submit some questions you have for some of our incredible panelists in the Q&A box that you should see on the bottom of your screen that Zoom has. Today we're hearing from panelists from Unilever, PepsiCo, Barclays, Kite Hill PR, GLAAD, and more. So don't miss a chance to let them hear from you. And we also want to hear from you as well with our polls. We'll be asking you some poll questions throughout the webinar just to gain your perspectives on everything we're sharing today. So please make sure to vote in the polls and let your voice be heard. So I will now pass it over to my co-host, Garrison Gibbons, so he can introduce himself. Hi, Garrison.
Hi, Ryan. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. As Ryan mentioned, my name is Garrison. I run people here at Knotch. And over the past few months at Knotch, we've done a series of roundtables with marketing professionals where we've really talked about the shift that COVID created in the marketing world, the change of remote workforce and how that's impacted marketing organizations, and really just spoke to the change that we're all experiencing across industries, marketing, comms, etc. And so a few months ago, or a month ago, I started ideating on how Pride would change as a result of COVID. And that was really where the conversation started, and where this conversation began, and where I started reaching out to each of our panelists. From there, we've actually seen, obviously, our world change drastically over the last week, and the amplification of Black voices as it comes to not only police brutality, but also systemic racism. And I believe we would be remiss today if we didn't discuss how Pride will also shift to discuss Black voices within the LGBTQ community, and also how intersectionality plays a part in both the internal and external strategies that all of our leaders that will be discussing Pride today will be taking effect within their organizations. So that is definitely going to be top of mind today as we continue to discuss the importance of Pride. And just want to start by saying that Pride itself, as many might share today, began as a riot. And so it would be remiss of us to not mention that. And mention that Pride itself is not only a celebration, but also Pride itself is political, and Pride itself demands for change. And so I think that amplifying Black voices now is more important than ever within our community, specifically when it comes to the LGBTQ community. So I'm excited to have those conversations with all of our leaders today. And I believe we're going to start with a poll before we introduce our first speaker. So Ryan, I'll let you kick off the poll, and then also as people begin to answer this poll, we will begin to introduce our first speaker.
Yes, really excited to introduce our first speaker. So we have today Connor Feeney. So Connor, welcome. Connor Feeney is the Senior Global Marketing Manager at Unilever, working for one of the fastest growing business units within the organization, which is home care, personal care, and foods for North America. So welcome, Connor.
Hi, Ryan. It's good to be here.
Good to see you.
Connor, let's start with an easy question. How has Unilever as a brand addressed Pride before, both perhaps internally or externally? And how has that changed over the recent weeks with COVID, and also with the recent conversation around the importance of telling Black stories and voices within the community?
So thank you for the question, Garrison. So obviously it's great to be here today. I think as an ally to the queer community, Unilever remains committed to championing equality, unity, fairness, and respect with and beyond its business. I think if I just go back to 2019 first, Unilever sponsored the World Pride in New York City, which marked the 50th anniversary last year. We launched a program called United We Stand, a Pride campaign that turns over the reins of its World Pride sponsorship to 6 New York-based organizations and 6 people at the forefront of communicating queer issues to highlight the issues that merit direct action. As we move forward now this year, so the good news is that we are still very much focused on supporting the queer community. And what we're doing is very focused on supporting grassroots organizations, not just in New York, but over the US, We're going to be telling the story of these organizations through a number of first responders who have been right at the front of the COVID epidemic. But our focus really is on driving allyship and an action to support these organizations. That's where our focus is, so that there's a direct benefit that goes back to them where it needs to go.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that has been a shift. And one of the things you and I spoke about before was around kind of this topic that has often come up within the community around rainbow washing, or the concept of really like brands putting up a rainbow logo and not really having a clear message behind that strategy, and or not telling the stories, to your point, of people within the community. So I think it's great that Unilever is really trying to amplify stories within the community, and also not only just share those stories out, but also push for action. And so how specifically are you guys really aiming to push for action, or have that call to action this Pride specifically?
So I think all of our focus, Garrison, on comms, from a comms perspective, is going to go towards supporting these organizations. So first of all, driving an awareness of what they do, and also then looking to drive a benefit for them as well. You're exactly right. I think everything today really needs to be authentic, and brands need to be careful not to just, be very bland in their comms and not really have much direct support or action. So, if we looked at it simply, it's about driving awareness, then it's about driving allyship, and then it's about driving a specific action that can help many of the grassroots queer organizations that are out there. And that's where our focus is right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense. In terms of kind of how you guys might have reallocated, I think some brands on the call, or some people on the call, might be interested to know how you might have reallocated some of your funds as a result of COVID-19, with Pride being canceled, or with a parade, obviously being canceled across different communities. How have you guys shifted that? Is it going straight to those organizations, it sounds like? Is that really where the pivot and reallocation is going?
That's a big part of it. And I think as well, when you look at typically, one of our challenges is, where can we drive the maximum reach to get the right awareness, to get that benefit through to those organizations? Now, with everyone working remotely, actually that's an opportunity from my perspective. It's an opportunity to reach a bigger audience than before. It simplifies our comms approach, because it means that we can reach these people via a direct channel. And we don't have to worry about, typically other things where we might get reach, like outdoor or any other elements or media strategies we could be using there. So we can simplify our approach from a comms perspective, and then, yes, drive a bigger benefit for those grassroots organizations as well.
Thank you, Connor. I appreciate it. Yeah, before I invite Ryan back in to introduce our next speaker, I do want to ask, what is one takeaway that you would like to kind of tell our audience today as it relates to Pride? Like, what is one piece of advice that you would give another brand or another person on this call as to how they can shift their own Pride messaging, or their own Pride experience this year as it relates to everything going on within our world?
Yeah, I think the few key elements that I would really highlight, Garrison. One is around awareness. So what are we driving awareness off? There needs to be a very clear comms approach to driving awareness to the relevant issues that are there, so that everyone is very, very clearly mindful and knows what's going on. I think from that awareness, we need to drive allyship across the queer community and outside the queer community. And then from that, very, very specific action. I watched an interview with Ken Frazier on CNBC a few days ago, and he spoke about the need for businesses to move beyond statements. And he's right. That's exactly what we have to do. It's about driving very real action, because if it's just a statement, it doesn't really mean anything. And that's where we need to get to.
Thank you so much, Connor. That's an amazing message, and I couldn't agree more with that sentiment. Stay on if you can for the Q&A that will be coming up shortly. And a reminder to the audience, please ask your questions for all the brand leaders that we have today in the Q&A box below. Ryan?
Yes, thank you so much, Connor. And now we're excited to introduce Jason Montgomery. So Jason Montgomery is an HR business partner with Siemens and the National Chair for Siemens USA LGBTQ+ Business Resource Group. He's excited to share his global experience leading strategic initiatives and overcoming diversity challenges for a large technology and engineering multinational. So hi, Jason. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Hi.
Yes. Hi.
Hi, Jason. How are you? I know this has been a very challenging week, both not only for our community, for our nation, but also for you as an HR leader within your organization. I can't imagine what you're going through. I mean, I can to a certain extent as an HR person, but I know that this time is really challenging. So I appreciate you taking the time. And I know that based on you and I's conversation, it sounds like some of Siemens' internal strategy around Pride has shifted as a result. Would that be correct?
That is correct. We have had to pivot. As we think of our activities, we were already focusing Pride Month on visibility for our community. So Siemens is 385,000 people across the globe. As you can imagine, we have presence in places where they're still fighting for LGBT equality and rights that we have here in the US. So a lot of regional variance that we had, but it was important to focus on visibility of our community being in the STEM field, and traditionally not having as many out employees in the company as we might compare to other organizations that are on this call. And hearing the voices of employees that even still sometimes might not feel comfortable coming out. So it was important to focus on visibility this month for us, and then also just education of the community. So we had a big push for the inclusive language in our company and educating people on gender neutral pronoun usage. That was our focus of what we were going to do for this Pride, in addition to participating in other events. And then with COVID happened, we had to repivot, and now in the current situation, partnering now with our Black employee community employee resource group, and reframing all of our communications, and doing partnership in some of our events, and now partnering with our Black employee community resource group for Juneteenth events as well, and using that as an opportunity for education and recognizing the intersectionality between our resource group and their resource group. So
I think that's a great point. You know, I've seen obviously white people struggle with the conversation around white privilege and understanding our innate privilege as white people in society, particularly the white queer community has struggled with the topic of privilege because they themselves are part of a community that is disenfranchised. So I see white queer people sometimes struggle with that conversation. And I think intersectionality too is kind of this newer conversation within the community that I don't think white queer people fully understand how being a Black trans individual really does amplify and expand your lack of privilege. It does disenfranchise you even further. So I think that conversation is even more important. And I would love to hear a little bit more about how, when partnering with your Black organization within Siemens, how you guys are working on that.
yeah, it's an important part. So immediately after everything that happened over the weekend and over the week, as we reframed our communication, it was first and foremost difficult for us to even use and say we're celebrating Pride or even saying Happy Pride, since we felt there was a level of education that was still needed to, even for our own community inside of Siemens, to let people understand the roots of Pride and the riot that it came from, thankfully, to our Black and brown, queer, and trans leaders that we had. So we immediately had to reframe that. And then from a personal perspective as well, I'm half Black, half white, and using my identity also as an educational opportunity for those that we're interacting with. And even as we've seen externally and internally, as we've reframed this communication, you see people that are speaking their viewpoints, even if you don't agree with them, and giving the opportunity to have this conversation in the company, which for a company like ours, if you know anything about us, very traditional, German-owned multinational, a lot of conservative viewpoints that we have, being that it's historically engineering as a company. So it's been a lot of brave conversations that we're having and just giving the space for people to have that moment, which is why we're now focusing so much on education, and also educating, working with our Black employee community as well, since they've never been engaged in our Pride events before, and we hadn't had that much collaboration. So that's also been a conversation about how do we continue this in the future and not just for this month.
I think that is so true. You know, I think education is so important, not only to straight allies who might not know, since it's often not covered in school, the queer movement and how rapid the queer movement has been in the scheme of movements, but also how Pride itself, yet while it is a celebration, did start as a riot. And I think I'm fascinated as a queer person by the trend because I do think it's related to marriage equality. I think as the queer community really fought for marriage equality, there was this move as a Pride initiative to really rally behind that idea of normalization and actually kind of like hiding the queerness or the non-normativity aspect of our community to really win equality when it comes to marriage equality. And so since that trend, it's really been seen as a celebration as we've won that, we've checked that box, so to speak. But I think intersectionality and the coverage of other queer voices within the community, both from a education around pronouns as it comes to, trans individuals or non-binary individuals still is lacking. I think, intersectionality within our community and understanding how Black queer people experience racism, how they experience both within the community and outside is so important. And I think the LGBTQ experience is so rare as it's one of those histories that actually doesn't get passed down generationally. And so it really is, the onus is on the queer individual as they come out to really take the time to learn all of these things. So I think education goes both ways, both for queer individuals themselves, particularly white queer individuals, and also for allies. And so it sounds like Siemens is really taking strides there to really attempt to really hone in on that aspect of Pride.
Yeah, and it's also been just a lot of refocusing as well, since we're not participating in the Pride event. So how can we reallocate some of that budget to other activities we might have not had the funding for? So we think, okay, more gender neutral restrooms that we're looking to implement, we have them at our major sites, but now that since that's a larger investment typically than some other topics, we can reallocate there. Investing in our communities and our partnerships with our local LGBT Chamber of Commerce as we think about the partnership and improving supplier diversity. So there's a lot that we can do to invest in our communities and inside our workplace as well. That might be more meaningful than participating in the Pride event to some degree as we think of what we do being really B2B. When we go to Pride parades, it's about finding talent and making sure people know who we are, but we also need to make sure inside the company, the workplace is prepared to accept these employees as well. And at some point you have to make that investment and continue to do it. So this has given us the opportunity to refocus some of those efforts as well.
Thank you, Jason. I was going to ask you what the key takeaways should be for Pride, but you just gave really an amazing list just there. So I appreciate you joining us, and please stick around for the Q&A. We have some great questions being asked as we speak. We do have the poll results, which I do want to share, and I think it's topical given the conversation Jason and I just had, that 54% of you guys say that amplifying Black voices across LGBTQ initiatives specifically should be the priority that brands take this Pride, as well as donate to LGBTQ causes, as well as doubling down on content during this time period. So really fascinating what you guys are sharing. And I think that actually transitions us well to our next speaker. So Ryan, take it away.
Yes. So we're very excited to welcome Jennifer Brown today. So Jennifer Brown is an award-winning entrepreneur, speaker, diversity and inclusion consultant, and author. She is the founder, president, and CEO of Jennifer Brown Consulting, and has been named one of the top 40 outstanding women by Stonewall Community Foundation and Woman of the Year by Pace University, just to name a few. So Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Yay.
Hi, Jennifer. How are you?
Hi, Garrison. Good. Thank you for having me.
Of course. For those of you that don't know, Jennifer is an influencer, for lack of a better term, across the DEI space. You can't really research and really delve deep into how brands should be addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion without finding Jennifer's name. So it is with great honor that I introduce her today, as I myself, as a people leader, have looked up to her for some time as it relates to fostering a diverse community, not only in Knotch, but along my career and as an openly queer individual. So thank you, Jennifer, for joining me.
Thank you so much, Garrison. I appreciate that.
So as you see in the poll that we shared, people really would like brands to amplify Black voices specifically within the community. As a DEI individual yourself, you consult a variety of brands on how they really should be tackling diversity, equity, and inclusion within their organization. And so I would love to hear from you first, just as an overarching kind of philosophy, why is DEI important? And specifically as it relates to Black voices within an organization, what can brands do on a, just intro level to really amplify those voices within their community and create DEI within their organization?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, we're all kind of rolling our eyes a lot at my company because we're just getting slammed with asks for help. And it's like, well, where were you? This has always been a crisis. And we've been trying to elevate the fact that so many of us are covering at work. So many of us have our own version of the closet at work. And we're all putting a lot of energy towards that, assimilation and dealing with microaggressions and, the double standards and triple standards, in terms of the things we hear about how we're showing up. And so we've been trying to get this message through. And so I think it's interesting to just notice that there's many brands that are trying to jump on the bandwagon right now and saying we have to do something. And then we're seeing in social media, like, don't do something or make a statement without being able to back it up, and so there's a lot of calls to action around like, okay, fine, Black Lives Matter, but, what does your board look like? What does your executive C-suite look like? What is your, what are you doing substantively? So this is a real moment of reckoning because I don't think you can flip a switch with this stuff. As a company, as an ally, like as an organization, you have to have been doing the work and you have to earn this. Allyship is a journey, not a destination. Shouldn't be something you could just write a check for or check a box on. And this is what I counsel the individual leaders we work with all the time, but companies and organizations go through the similar sort of ally journey, from unaware to awareness to activation to advocacy. And we all know what it looks like when it's not only, done at the top or out externally, but we know too what we hear from employees who still say, well, I'm closeted here, even though my company is winning all the awards. Why is that? So I think the queer community and the Black community have things in common that we talk about when we say we aren't able to bring our full selves to work, or we deal with violence and safety issues and marginalization. Like there's that intersectionality we've been talking about that actually connects all of the affinities, a lot of the affinities together, and that runs sort of horizontally as a thread through all of our experiences in the world of ERGs. Mental health is another piece that's been elevated because of COVID, for example, before all this happened. So right now it's like everything is kind of, the planets are aligning and finally we have the attention for change. And I know in my community of advocates and practitioners, we are like literally jamming our foot in the door and saying like, don't let it close, like keep people in the discomfort so that change can actually happen. And we can have the difficult conversations that people have been avoiding for so long.
Yeah, and I think that something that's brought up a lot in the DEI kind of world is around like kind of the invisible identities. So like disabilities, like queerness to a certain extent, like mental health. Those conversations have either typically been placed as not work or, that's supposed to be kept outside of work. And so I would love to hear how you're seeing brands tackle that specifically, as I think a lot of the queer community would fall into that invisible, if they're not out at their workplace or if they don't speak openly about it, they can, and maybe some brands say they should keep it outside of work. I would love to hear how you're seeing that conversation specifically play out, particularly as we move to be a more remote workforce where I think invisibility can even amplify, if you're not visible in front of a screen.
It's so true. We often teach the iceberg metaphor, and that waterline is really high. In the physical workplace, I think a lot of us covered a lot, which means like minimizing a known stigmatized identity. That's Kenji Yoshino's work. But in the virtual world, interestingly, I have had friends say it's actually liberating to work in this way. And I think it's because some of us carry physical characteristics that trigger others. Across a whole host of identities. And I also think that we are being forced to actually come out more about who we are in the virtual world, which is really fascinating. Parents with kids, mental health needs, and, we're literally coming into each other's lives. And so I do think even before the last couple of weeks, the crisis and the pandemic and the work from home was forcing a level of truth sharing about our lives, right? And I don't know if we can put that back in the bottle, so to speak. I do think when we say bring our full selves to work, we are literally living in an experiment of that. And I think it's exponentially increasing empathy, which then leads to policy changes and, less covering in the workplace, et cetera. So I have a lot of hope for what's going to take a quantum leap as a result of all this. And so, but we need to storytell and elevate different voices in our companies to show, like, here, when we say bring your full self to work, this is what we need. We need to demonstrate that. We need to encourage people who feel vulnerable actually to share, encourage that sharing, that standing up, and acknowledge the risk of doing so, and then allies are needed to provide the net. If you're asking people to leap and normalize more of like what's happening for them, the net has to be there. And I believe the allyship is responsible for building that net, but for building that safe space in a culture of belonging, so that when you do show up bigger and you do show up more honestly, that like allies are there. And I think I wanted to just build on what you said. I think those of us in the queer community, there's many of us that are underutilizing our allyship. I am LGBTQ since I was 22. I've been out, but I'm also cisgender. I'm also white. I also have a certain socioeconomic background, and I try to activate around those constantly to notice who's not in the room, to notice who's not being heard. And I think just because you're in a marginalized community does not mean that you understand or practice inclusion. It means you have a head start on understanding what that is like, but there's so much more that we need to be doing to ensure that our community is more inclusive. And so that's kind of what I've dedicated a lot of time to.
Yeah, I love that. And that's actually, that was a question we got in the Q&A that I think you answered so beautifully. It's very important for all of us to acknowledge, particularly the white people on this panel and in this conversation, to acknowledge our privilege, and then also understand that allyship equals action, and eventually, to your point, does lead to advocacy, and that you actually have to not only say the right things, you also have to do the right things. And it's our responsibility as white people this time more than ever to really amplify the conversations that Black and Brown people have been having for centuries. And so thank you so much for sharing that, Jennifer, and please stick around for the Q&A because we have a lot of more interesting questions. Ryan?
Absolutely.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much for that. Very well said. We are also welcoming to the virtual stage today, Luzerne McAllister. So Luzerne McAllister works in the global diversity and engagement at PepsiCo, where he drives and enables the global expansion of ERGs, as well as driving the global LGBT agenda for PepsiCo. So Luzerne, welcome.
Thank you. And I always also like to throw out there that I'm the founder of an organization called Rolodex Global, and our mission is to elevate and celebrate LGBT professionals of African descent.
I was muted. What an amazing time for an organization like that than now. And I know you've been putting in the work there for some time. You and I spoke a lot about PepsiCo and kind of the changes you guys have been going through when it comes to your Pride initiatives as a result of COVID. But you and I haven't had the chance to touch base as it relates to now the need to amplify Black voices within the community. Specifically. And if you've read recent news as it relates to Black trans lives and the beating that went down recently where 30 men beat a Black trans woman, the conversation could not be more important to have, that Black trans people die at a higher rate than white trans people or than Black people within the community. And so it's really important to amplify also the intersectionality there. And so I would love to hear your thoughts on that topic when it comes to amplifying Black voices within the queer community, and how you guys are shifting your Pride initiatives now, given the new national discourse around police brutality and the importance of Black lives.
Which one do you want first?
I would love to hear first what you were planning and how that shifted.
Sure. So I will say that, and my perspective in general is to maintain what I consider to be the status quo, in a sense, of moving forward. Like, everyone right now is looking at this moment, whether it's COVID or not. COVID accelerated things, but it didn't actually change the fact that these groups that were marginalized before, right? And it made it shown more. And what's going on right now in terms of the Black Lives Matters crisis isn't something new or different in my mind. It's not something that's changed. This has made the media cycle, and I have my thinking that this is making the media cycle because we had a presidential election, all these things. But Ahmaud Arbery happened in February. We didn't start really talking about it until May, right? So, this notion that all of a sudden people have woken up to what has literally been a daily occurrence for so many people on a regular basis to varying levels is already a fail, and something that I've been working very hard to kind of misspell and tell people, no, this is happening yesterday, this was happening, this is happening now, and it's going to happen tomorrow, unless we realize that this is not just a moment in time, right? And that we need to have a sustained level of vigilance and action to match what is going on. In terms of our Pride celebrations and our Pride, what we're looking to do, we had last year a lot of external kind of representation and activations that were great. We partner with our Bubbly brand, which was very much came out in 2018 with a very LGBTQ kind of fun Pride feel in terms of its brand DNA. But then on top of that, we added Pepsi to that, and then we had Doritos Rainbow going on in LATAM, where, not only was that happening in CDMX in Mexico City, but what was interesting is that our Doritos Rainbow brand actually took that to Rock in Rio, which is like one of the largest concerts in the world, if not the largest, and not an LGBT or specifically a Pride event. It's an open all event, but they took that very specific Doritos Rainbow to that event to say, hey, we're here to talk about being authentically and unapologetically who we are. And so we're going to do it even in this Brazilian kind of racist and homophobic climate, in the political climate that exists in there. So we intended to do similar types of things, going back out big into the community. The reality is that our money in terms of COVID and supporting our own employees and keeping the business running has been very expensive. And so all of that kind of money dried up very quickly. And so what we started to do is say, okay, how else can we make an impact? How else can we make a statement? So first of all, one of our brands actually is still going to be doing something. We are partnering with we are partnering with GLAAD. And what we're doing there is actually supporting drag queen community in New York. So this is a very North Division, New York area based activation that we're focusing on. And a lot of the drag queens in that area are now out of work, cannot do the same entertainment. So we are doing a whole virtual online activation, really featuring and supporting them, where they can actually, make some money out of this and actually get some donations from this. And we're also donating to GLAAD. We've started to do some partnerships and donations elsewhere. So that's from an external perspective. We're still doing that. Internally, our biggest pivot is just pivoting to online virtual series, but we have, I would say, at least 10 to 12 events going on throughout this month for Pride. And our hashtags are kind of, Pride is never canceled and we see you. And so we're saying, despite everything that's going on, we still know that this community needs help. This community needs visibility, both within our walls, but also externally to our communities. We're doing a lot of education. We have an internal call that's called Trans Connect, where it's for and by our trans employees only. So I don't even join those calls myself, and they have their space to talk about it. And we're also doing our own kind of internal education. So the things that we're doing internally, including these backgrounds and all those things, that's also happening. What's different in this moment now is that, and there have been a lot of questions, some things have been postponed, but nothing has been canceled. So even though we have a Black Lives Matter crisis in the media going on right now, and people said, oh, well, and this happened with COVID too. This happened, so do we need to stop everything? And no, you don't stop your diversity engagement agenda. Oh, well, this is happening, Black Lives Matter, do we stop Pride? No, we contextualize it and make sure people understand, like you said when you open, that Pride is a celebration of a riot. It is a celebration of civil unrest. It is a celebration of a Black trans woman, Latina trans woman, and a white lesbian being tired of police brutality, right? And carrying that forward. And over the years, I think some of that messaging has gotten lost to the point where people call Pride a parade when it's an actual march. It was a march. And so what we made sure to do is use this moment to educate and say, look, the leader of the Black Panther Party, Huey Newton, 2 months after the very first Pride March that ever existed, wrote a whole one-page like manifesto on why the Black community needs to partner with he said the homosexual gay liberation movement, that's what it was called. And he wrote a whole paper on why that is. And because he recognized that they were in the same struggle around authorities attacking marginalized groups that were suffering, and around police brutality and a criminal justice system that targeted them and treated them differently. And then there's, of course, the intersectionality, people who exist in the intersection of the two, right? And recognizing that there is a compounding of experience when that happens, a compounding of stress, a compounding of all of the different things of the social ills that you hear about now. That's been happening. And in some cases, or in those cases, you get it from both sides in both dimensions. So I think that's kind of the external, internal, as well as kind of what we're doing right now, given this moment, is absolutely a time to lift up the voice of those who are Black and LGBT. But I think it requires people to know the history, and it requires people to understand the context. It requires people to clearly know what the similarities and the differences are between the movements. Because sometimes people are like, oh, one's worse than the other, or, they'll start to create walls between the movements. And it's really important that people understand both the differences between the movements and the experiences, as well as the similarities and how they impact. And so, for those two questions, I think I answered those two questions fully now. That, that's what we've done, and that's how we're taking this moment forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate everything that you said, and I couldn't agree more as it relates to Pride being a riot, and really making sure that we don't lose sight of that. And I think that goes both internal and external. And as it relates to, this event, as you guys know, this event was originally launched over a month ago with the intention of talking about COVID. And there were conversations held internally. And there were poses as we reached out to panelists about pushing this conversation due to the rise of the Black Lives Matter conversation. And I said, no, it's relevant to the conversation. And I still think this conversation is relevant to have. It's even more relevant to have, in my opinion, today, because I think we as a community, and particularly white individuals within the LGBTQ experience, have a responsibility to amplify Black lives. And I think it's something we haven't done, and we have been hesitant to do as an overarching community, particularly as it comes to the Pride March and as it relates to actual Pride events that take place all over the globe and Pride parades. It's mostly been a white celebration. And I think that's because of the shift, as I painted earlier, to marriage equality, which was very much a white-facing external conversation. And I think now as a queer community, we really have to tie it back to our original roots, which is justice and peace. And we currently don't have justice and peace for Black individuals in this country. And that's something that I'm looking forward to continuing discussing today with our panelists. We now are going to shift to a Q&A, and we do have a lot of interesting questions. Some of them have been answered naturally through the course of our conversation, but Knotch team, if you can switch to the Q&A view, if we haven't already, I will begin asking some of the questions. So one of the questions from an anonymous member viewing asked, can we talk more about specific internal education and how we can reduce microaggressions? Is there anyone here who would like to take that question to start? how can we really start internal education, and how do we educate our team to reduce microaggressions? And there was a few questions about microaggressions specifically. And so I would love to touch on that topic.
Yeah, so I'll jump in here and start. Especially given what's going on right now, there is a lot of discussion internally. Leaders in my company are certainly reaching out with, what do we do? And our first thing is to create spaces for people to talk. So I think we've thrown this term around allyship and trying to understand what that is. And I believe that most people are failing to be allies, or have been failing, and are only now realizing that they failed. And I think one of the things that needs to happen is that allyship requires a certain level of rigor. So it first requires a certain level of self-education, because if you really want to know something, you will go find it out, and Google is around. Like, it's not that hard to look up so many things, right? So people immediately jump to, oh, I need to put my fellow Black person on a stage and have them talk to us. No, before we spend our energy and time telling you about our experience, go do your own research so that you have the full context before we spend our energy and time, because our energy and time is already expensed at this point. So first thing is educate yourself. The second thing is then invite us to the table for us to listen, and for you to listen to us. And that means listen fully to the experiences, to the perspective, to the things that you may find troubling or offensive. Take it all in and deal with it later on your own time. Cry if you have to, but take it all in and listen to it. And then the third thing is, after you digested everything that you've learned about, then you go back and educate yourself some more, as well as commit to taking a very specific action, one thing that you're going to do differently for yourself, and then inwardly, as well as then outwardly, as you then try and take the message forward about what you've learned. And I think that kind of path and process is whether it's LGBT, Latino, people who are differently abled, whatever it is, whatever the community is being centered, if you're going to be an ally for that community, that's my recommendation on how to activate your allyship fully. Otherwise, you're just throwing around statements about yourself in similar ways that people are accusing companies of throwing around statements. People are walking around throwing around statements about how they're such good allies, or they thought they're good allies, or making statements about Black Lives Matter, and then they're not embodying that in their day-to-day lives pre this moment, and probably it won't be sustained after this moment unless they do this. So for me, I'm very prescriptive about, how you educate yourself and how you do that. In terms of microaggressions, I'll use the buzz term of the day as being an upstander. So people are saying, don't be a bystander, be an upstander, which means that if you see something go down, right, you would call it out and say, that's not okay, right? And don't just be a bystander and watch a microaggression happen. Stand up and say, this is not okay. If you are someone who is being microaggressed, then there are two things you can do, because one, you're not responsible for standing up in that moment. You're kind of the victim in that moment. So you may have to take it, but then go to your tribe and talk it out, because you need to build up kind of your courage and your confidence, and you need to be affirmed and reaffirmed of who you are, and that you are special and fabulous and all of these things. And then I would say the third thing is, if you are someone who thinks that you have not microaggressed onto someone else, then you are lying to yourself, right? And so as someone who, everyone has a level of privilege. Privilege is contextual, right? And so even as a Black person in America, I have privilege especially if I leave America. I have American privilege if I go to certain other countries, right? So understanding one's privilege is very, very important. And until you understand your privilege, you won't be able to check yourself. And if you check yourself, then you are also going to be the microaggressor, whether you meant to be or not. And in these days and times, you don't get brownie points for your intention.
Yep.
Because if you were well-intentioned, but you still destroyed the other person, you didn't even know it, that's your issue. That's not anyone else's issue. So those are the 3 areas that I would say for each one of those roles around a microaggression.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic answer. And I think you laid those 3 points out amazingly. In terms of the American privilege, because actually there is a question relating to that, Jennifer or Jason or any of our other panelists on the call, how in other countries are you seeing people address these conversations, both as it relates to queer lives, but also as it relates to Black queer lives? Since there are these, there is areas where these topics are illegal, where they're not allowed to be had. How are global brands on the call, or Jennifer, how are you seeing some global companies address the topic of pride, or just specifically Black lives within the pride community in certain countries where it's not as accepted? Jason?
Yeah, so happy to speak on that. So at Siemens, it is difficult when you think about a big part of our business, which is in the energy space. And we promote our acceptance of the LGBT community, and as simple as just changing the logo to the rainbow colors. There's a lot of feedback that's received from South America and the Middle East, where we have major energy projects bringing the necessary industry that's needed for those areas. And it brings into question, do you put your commitment to society before your commitment as a business? And our leaders have actively advocated for our community and said that this is our stance as Siemens. We continue these projects in those regions because we're providing a service that's needed to bring, in that example, energy to those regions. And we understand that even our customers might have different viewpoints from us, and of course those governments, and it escalates to an executive level, and they're the ones discussing with those government leaders. But we don't back off of our stance and our support for the community. But I see that there's conflict for businesses depending on the regions that they're in. So at a local internal level, we have to make sure that everything we do is still regionalized and we're not sacrificing people's safety as well. So making sure that whenever communications are going out, we don't send mass communications across because we fear sometimes from a self-identification purpose. If people even are attending a pride event and they're in one of those regions, there could be repercussions. And we have to think about that and just how we communicate. So it is about being intentional and taking a stance and putting society sometimes before the business. That's at least the Siemens case at the moment.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. We have to get to some of our other panelists, but we are doing another Q&A shortly. So thank you guys so much. And Ryan, can you help me introducing our next panelist?
Sure can. So I'm very excited to introduce Michael Garrett. So Michael Garrett is a principal in the specialty practice at Mercer, human resources consulting organization. Michael has more than 30 years of experience in the healthcare management and healthcare quality field. He is the North American co-chair of Mercer's Pride Business Resource Group and also serves on the City of Seattle's LGBTQ Commission. So welcome, Michael. Glad to have you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Hi, Michael. And actually, we've gotten a lot of questions in our Q&A around how B2B companies address the topic of LGBTQ and pride. And so I know that Mercer is a B2B company, so I'm excited to touch on that with you. And so, Michael, why don't you share kind of how Mercer has been addressing the topic of pride and how that shifted as it relates to COVID, and then we can kind of go from there.
Sure. So thanks for having me. I use he, him, his pronouns. I would put it in my video, but I don't know how to do that. And we also have the pride flag, but I also don't know how to do that yet. So sorry about that. I've been at Mercer for 5 years, and I think the evolution is very similar to what others have said, which we start out at first with education, like one-on-one education for folks. And we got a lot of people who were allies or who wanted to be allies. And it was just really kind of understanding the alphabet soup of LGBTQ, what that means. We then went to an allyship where we did educational sessions with other BRGs. So we have a racial and ethnic diversity BRG, women at Mercer, and so forth. And so we really combine together to say, what is an ally, regardless of whatever group we're talking about. Last year, because of the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, we really focused on the history of Stonewall, what it meant. It was a riot. It was also primarily transgender women of color who led that. So I want to just kind of make sure that we all acknowledge that, since it's such a group that has been disenfranchised in this country. And then this year, even prior to COVID and the whole racial unrest that we're experiencing right now, we are capturing it with intersectionality. So the theme this year is different identities, different experiences, and all pride. So that really speaks to the fact that, you know, we are not monolithic in LGBTQ employees, whether it's race or abilities, age for someone who's in his 60s, being an elder in the community. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge that there's a wide range of folks out there. Yeah.
Awesome. And yeah, we actually got a question in our Q&A around what constructive pride initiatives can be done in a virtual setting, and how are you seeing that? I know that Mercer is a global brand, and I actually spoke to people on your team from different areas. So does this actually make the opportunity for pride be more accessible at Mercer, given that it's in a virtual setting? Or have you always celebrated it in a virtual setting? Curious how you guys are seeing the virtual kind of honoring of pride within your internal organization.
Sure, a couple things. One is that we made a decision actually this year that rather than just having a global Pride BRG, we actually have regions of the country because the needs were different in Latin America versus North America, Europe, Asia, and so forth. And then within, for example, the United States, we have chapter leaders. And so there isn't just one thing that we're doing. Each chapter, each region around the globe, are all doing their own events and initiatives that make sense for them. Also this year, we have an openly gay white man who leads up our healthcare practice. So we actually had him do a video kicking off the month. We've done things like a bingo game to test people's understanding of history of LGBTQ, since we've done trainings on history. So trying to making it fun, educational, and also driving home a point around diversity and inclusiveness. And the whole idea is that bring the whole authentic self to work, right? That we're not just our sexual orientation or gender identity. You know, we're a parent, we're, you know, a professional, we're an elder, whatever it is, you know, you have faith community, all of those things together comprise who you are.
Awesome. And then lastly, you know, as someone who represents kind of the LGBTQ internal kind of conversation at Mercer, would love to hear what would be one piece of advice or one key takeaway you would like our audience to walk away with today as it relates to how to handle pride this year within your organization?
I think one is to be sensitive to the fact, and there's been some discussion, like some people may not feel like celebrating right now. It can be a really difficult time for some individuals. And so to allow that to happen, and I've actually started some meetings like, I just want to acknowledge this may be a difficult time, and do we still want to even have this meeting? Do we need to reschedule it? Or, you know, if you're having difficulty concentrating, maybe we do a follow-up. So to acknowledge different people are at different places on the spectrum, whether it's COVID or the racial injustice we're dealing with, to allow that to be and to have people acknowledge pride in whatever way feels appropriate for them. And it may not be celebratory, it might be in another kind of way.
Thank you, Michael. Ryan, let's introduce our next panelist.
Sure, let's do it. Also, sorry if my internet cuts out. Oops, technological difficulties. So let's see, next we have Rachel Typograph. I'm happy to welcome her back. We've seen her with our Knotch and McMack roundtables, and that's been super fun. So Rachel Typograph is the founder and CEO of McMack. She's been recognized as Forbes 30 Under 30 who are changing the world, Marie Claire's 50 most influential women in America, and Fast Company's most creative people in business, just to name a few. So hi, Rachel.
Hey, Ryan.
Hi.
Hi, Rachel. Rachel, as I previously mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, has done an amazing job working with Knotch on having these weekly roundtables where you've heard from amazing marketers across different industries to really hear how they're dealing with the change. And I know that we have plans to have even more conversations around that in the coming weeks. But I'm excited to have you specifically on this topic, as I know that you have always had so many interesting tidbits around how businesses, particularly in the e-commerce space, are responding. And I'm sure you also have had interesting views or kind of perspective on previous years as it relates to Pride and how brands have built campaigns or e-commerce campaigns around that. So I would love to hear kind of what your thoughts are going into this Pride and how you are already seeing brands, if you are, dealing with the topic of Pride this year.
Yeah. Well, one, thanks for doing this. I think it's amazing. I was listening in on the conversation and I text Anda that you guys are killing it. You know, before the last few weeks, I think a lot of brands had trepidation around what to do for Pride, because Pride has always really meant in real life events. I have another sort of business that I work on outside of MicMac that has to do with a lot of live events. And we saw a lot of brands canceling those Pride events and then asking themselves the questions, what should we do instead? And having very little answers. Fast forward to everything that's been happening with Black Lives Matters. I think that Pride for a lot of brands now is a moment that they need to participate in, but I don't think they're just gonna make it about Pride. I think that they're gonna make it about all minority groups. You know, my personal ask of all these brands, what I always say is supporting minority groups shouldn't just happen in June. Like, how do we actually make it 365 days a year? And so a lot of people are acting really quickly to get plans in place because most people honestly had canceled it because of COVID. So we'll see what's going to happen, but I do think that a lot of brands will start having more activations. And then from a merchandising standpoint, I mean, those things are planned a year in advance. So anyone who is going to have Pride swag in stores, it's already available. And, you know, I think, again, that's kind of lackluster year after year because it only happens in June when it should happen 365 days.
Absolutely. And then as a queer founder yourself, how have you seen educating your employees internally as a priority, both, I guess, on this topic of Black Lives Matter and the current situation we're facing, but also as it relates to queerness and kind of the umbrella that is LGBTQ? How do you see it as your responsibility when it comes to that internal education?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the early things that I noticed when I was building MicMac was how forthcoming I was in the interview process that I'm gay. I just felt like if someone was not comfortable working for a gay CEO, I want them to self-select out of the process. Like, I don't even want you a part of my company. And that has continued to be how I operate now 5 years into the business. And one of the big things that I did when building the company was I made it a point of ensuring that I have a diverse workforce. It caused me to honestly hire slower, but I'm so grateful that I did it. I would say a fourth of my company is queer and a third of my company is not white. And it's really this most incredible place. And as a result, like, people are very woke. Because we have such a diverse team, you have to be really self-aware about what you say. And that's not to say that we have it right every single day. You know, sometimes someone makes a comment not realizing how another person's going to internalize it. But the big thing is that we give real-time feedback. Because if you don't address those things in the moment, it will become a virus within your company. And so that's just a huge part of our culture. In terms of Black Lives Matters, you know, on Sunday, I wrote a note to my company, just immediately addressing what's going on. I'd say the majority of my company does live in New York City. And so they're obviously in the epicenter and they're living it. And my big thing was reinforcing that, you know, we have a zero tolerance policy for racism of any type. And immediately I actually posed a survey in the email and I asked my company, how would you like MicMac to support Black Lives Matter? I think a big thing with inclusion is that it can't just come from the top. It has to come from the employee base. And amazing ideas started to flow in that we've already began to enact. And it just became, someone earlier in another conversation was talking about training. Something that just became so apparent to me over the last 5 days is, and Garrison, you know this, I've been looking for a head of people for a long time. She actually starts next Monday, and we cannot wait. But for a long time, I kept saying, when the head of people comes, we'll figure things out. And I realized that I was just making excuses, because these issues are so challenging. And then if you don't feel equipped to navigate it yourself, you kind of keep brushing it under the rug or putting it at the bottom of the to-do list. And I said to my company, I do all hands yesterday on Wednesdays, I was like, I take full accountability for not having ongoing training around this topic, because most of the employee base feels ill-equipped to talk about it.
Yeah, I think that is so true. And as it relates to you speaking, like in your interview process, really being open about your queerness, that's definitely something that I, as a queer employee, have also seen that I do. I'm sure Anda, my CEO, would say that I probably mentioned that I was gay several times in my interview, but it was, you know, as a queer Mississippian, someone who's from the South, like I definitely have felt the need to ensure that I belong and am safe within an organization. And so I definitely have overcompensated on the queerness, just to make sure that I can see how they respond in real time, can engage with the interviewer and make sure that it's something that the culture is cool with, or the culture is accepting of. And that's something that's been really important to me. So I love that you shared that message. Thank you, Rachel, for joining us. You can stick around. We'll have a Q&A in a second, but I'm trying to get all these panelists in. We might have overbooked on panelists. So Ryan, feel free to interrupt me.
Yes, yes. And yeah, thank you so much, Rachel. Great to see how you're structuring your team at NICMAC. We also have today Mark Lane. So Mark Lane is the Global Head of Corporate Communications and Banking at Barclays, where he is currently responsible for all comms, internal and external, for the banking business within the investment bank. So welcome, Mark.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for having me.
Hi, Mark. Super excited to have this conversation with you today. So I've obviously seen Barclays Pride initiatives, and I'm sure anyone that is a consumer of Barclays has seen that over the years. I have always said that the financial sector has been one of probably the most public, outward-facing Pride brands, or kind of sectors to really take Pride fully on for years. And so interested to hear how Pride looks this year, as I know Barclays and others have always been major sponsors for the in-person events. So curious how Barclays is handling Pride this year, both internally and externally, to the extent that you can share.
Great, yeah. So I am delighted, Garrison, that you've seen some of the work that we've done in the past. That makes me super proud. Alongside my day job at Barclays, I have for the past 10 years been the chair or the co-chair of our America's LGBTQ employee network. And so what we've tried to do in years past is do a bunch of events that appeal both to our employees, to our institutional clients, to our retail clients, and engage a real cross-section of individuals. So last year during our Pride celebrations, we hosted a variety of events. The two most successful events by far were about intersectionality. So our kickoff event for Pride was an event that we hosted with one of our most important clients that looked at the role of the Black community in LGBT history. And that was really successful. We had a lot of people show up for it. We opened that up to non-Barclays colleagues as well. So that was, that's how we kicked off Pride. And then actually in early July, we hosted an event featuring Abby Wambach, the soccer player, and a lady called Inai Aluko, who is a Black straight soccer player who currently plays in Italy. And that was, again, a hugely popular event. This year, as everybody knows, we can't do events in person. So we are, the same as everybody else has commented here, we're pivoting a lot of our stuff to be virtual. There are pros and cons to doing that. The pros for me are that in the past, the programming that we produce for Barclays, being a UK headquartered company, the program that we produce out of the UK has been really difficult to, push into jurisdictions around the world. That this year, because everything is virtual, is so much easier to do. The flip side to that is, I think everybody has a little bit of Zoom fatigue right now. So we're really trying to think about how we can come up with differentiated content. For us, Pride has always been about the intersectionality. And so, I was on one of the last conference calls that I was on last night was with some of our senior management and our Embrace Employee Network, which is our sort of multicultural network. And we were talking about how we can increase the voice of Black and Brown colleagues at Barclays in what we're doing over the next couple of months across all facets of our D&I landscape. So we had some great ideas come out of that conversation. That is one of the first calls that I'm having tomorrow morning is, putting some of those actions into place. And then externally, Barclays as a brand in the US is by and large business to business. In the UK, we have a huge retail presence. We're sort of the JP Morgan Chase of the UK. And so in the UK, we're still doing all of the stuff that we had done in the past in terms of putting images onto ATMs, putting posters up into our branches, the vast majority of which are still open in the UK. And we do a huge amount on social media and on our website. Here in the US, while we are mostly a B2B brand, we, for anybody that's been into Times Square, hopefully you will have seen the Barclays building at the northern end of Times Square. We have these huge LED screens on the outside of that building. Those screens are currently showing in the rotation. We have a message about our commitment to the Black community using images from events that we had hosted in the past 12 months. So that, that content for us was really easy to produce and put onto those screens. And then later this month, we're going to increase the frequency of Pride imagery on those screens, again, using content from events that have actually happened within the past 12 months within the Barclays community. So, it's difficult, I think, for a lot of brands to think about how you do Pride in a virtual environment without stepping onto everybody else's turf. But we're committed to doing a bunch of stuff both internally and externally.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important, and I'm glad that you guys are staying strong. In terms of kind of the one takeaway that you would provide to our audience, how has it been in terms of internally keeping kind of consistency this Pride? And what would be your major takeaway to brands that have, or maybe even haven't, had Pride initiatives and how they should go about it this Pride? Like, what would be your one piece of advice from an external perspective?
Sure. So each year, I would say, Barclays looks at what we've done over the prior years in terms of Pride, and we really take the opportunity to step back and say what is working right now and what isn't working. One of the things that we did last year that worked really, really well is try and figure out how you can engage way more people in the activities that you're doing around Pride. So, the Pride March in New York City, for anybody that's done it, can be a very long day. And we chose last year, given the length of the march, to actually just do a watch party and invite along a bunch of our institutional clients, a bunch of our retail clients, and we made it an event that was specifically family friendly. So we had a whole bunch of craft activities for kids. What we wanted to do was create an event that people felt coming along to for just a half hour if that's all they wanted, or staying the entire day. And they can bring their kids, they can bring their grandparents, and it gives them an opportunity to experience Pride in a way that, those, two extremes of the sort of age grouping would have struggled to do otherwise. My one recommendation for brands who are struggling to find ideas for what to do for Pride this year is don't think too hard about it. Just find an idea that you think is gonna work and get out there and do it. The hardest thing, I think, for a lot of people when you're starting an employee network or figuring out how to make your brand more relevant in a specific space is, particularly for D&I stuff, is worrying about getting it wrong. And from my perspective, I think the most wrong thing that you can do is nothing. As long as you're prepared to go out there and use your event as an opportunity to hear people's input and feedback, and you're honest and open about that, you're far better off doing something than avoiding engaging in the debate.
Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate it. Thank you for sharing. Ryan?
Yes, so I'm actually very excited about this next speaker. So I'm welcoming Rachel Hadley. She is the president at Kite Hill PR, a leading public relations agency specializing in the media, advertising, and tech sectors. And I've actually worked with her myself in the past when I was at Kite Hill. So Rachel, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah.
Hi, Rachel. Nice to meet you. We actually had a question come in from our audience, and I told them to wait until we had you join us because it was related to PR. So they said, beyond anti-discrimination policies, which are important, how can PR agencies implement Pride marketing internally versus focusing solely on the client efforts?
Interesting. I mean, I think, for us, we definitely focus internally, so I can speak to that on a personal level. Because people are such a big part of our focus. And while we are a smaller agency, we don't quite have the large budgets of some of the huge corporations that have already spoken already, which you all have. I've really enjoyed hearing all of your thoughts so far. It doesn't matter your size to speak internally and to have give your teams a voice. And so I think it's about amplification, amplifying voices internally. And facilitating that discussion in a thoughtful, meaningful way. Garrison, you also made the point of not having, the generational, not being able to pass down the knowledge. And it's interesting because, last year we did a big education around what Stonewall was, because many of our team members think of it as a parade versus a march. So there's a lot of things that we can do internally from a PR standpoint, no doubt.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of what you're seeing maybe on the PR side from your brands, how have they been mentioning? Because I do think that in the past specifically, a lot of the brand initiatives that were done during Pride were amplified in a PR perspective. Like definitely they wanted media behind it. I even saw this year before this Black Lives Matter conversation really amplified, Skittles went black and white this Pride and said kind of there was only one rainbow. That was definitely a PR initiative. Are you seeing like less PR requests around what people are doing about Pride, or are you seeing kind of the same, it's just a different lens, or really focusing on parts of the LGBTQ community instead of a broad kind of brush?
Yeah, I think it's a different lens. I mean, until this week, the biggest challenge was around being in a remote place. So the challenges were all the same as the challenges that we all experienced in March, and just figuring out how to find spaces that we could still continue to share community, even though we are first physically distant. Messaging, there's a lot of internal comms is how we're helping our clients more than we have before. When most people think of PR agencies, they think more about media relations. And there's definitely the internal comms piece that's gotten big. It's also around guidance. So I do identify, I am a member of the LGBTQ plus community. So I know there were questions about, from a few of you about who identifies as part of that. I am, and as leader, I mentioned that. I also mentioned it in the interview process, and I've mentioned it for every job I've ever gone to for the same reason that was discussed earlier. But I have had moments, and I don't know how I'm going to celebrate Pride this year. But what I do know is, and it's because of my Black friends, my Black community that has reached out and said, has wished me a happy Pride. They were the first ones to do it. And one of my favorite things, one of my friends said, I was like, I can't believe you reached out to me. Like, there's so much going on in the world right now. I almost forgot because it was June 1st. And she said, yeah, see, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And I loved that so much because it's true. Like, it is a reminder that we can't ignore one thing because something else is important. That's why we've selectively, ignored vulnerable people in the past. It's because there's a lot of causes out there sometimes. And while, you know, many of them are important, some of them are important at different levels and at different times. And so I was personally planning, I was just like, I'm not even in the mood to celebrate Pride this year. And some friends have brought me back and reminded me that, you know, in the last 12 months, there are a lot of people who came out. There were a lot of trans lives lost. There was a lot of youth suicide. You know, just because things are happening differently this year doesn't mean that things aren't still happening, that we need to still continue to address and create visibility and show that we are so proud, because things do get better, and all of those things that that we want to make sure that we continue to say. And that's important to say internally to your team. It's important to say with your clients as well, and just as people.
I love that. And that is so true. As a queer person myself, I too have been struggling with the Pride conversation. And for me, so much of Pride has been about the march. You know, I'm a queer person from Mississippi, like I said earlier. And when I first moved to New York, I was blown away. Oh my God. And I was blown away by what Pride looked like in New York City.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just, it's sad that that isn't happening in that same experience, but I think it makes our message and our conversation around Pride so much more important this year. So thank you so much for sharing that, Ryan.
Garrison, I think you and I could have our own conversation about experience of racism and homophobia and transphobia in the South, and what this means. It's an important movement for everything.
Soon over a glass of wine or something. Ryan, back to you as we introduce our final speaker.
Yes.
And then I have an announcement to make before she gets started.
He does, and thank you so much, Rachel. It was great to have you. So last but certainly not least, we actually have Sarah Kate Ellis with us today. Sarah Kate Ellis is the president and CEO of GLAAD, where she has refocused GLAAD's crucial advocacy to accelerate acceptance of the LGBT community. Ellis was included on Variety's New Power of New York list, was named one of Out Magazine's Out 100, and listed as one of Family Circle's 20 most influential moms, among many other honors. So welcome.
Hi, Sarah Kate.
Hi.
Just want to announce quickly that our team will be sharing a link out via the chat to Gives. Gives is one of our partners that we utilize for our internal charities and our internal donations that we make at Knotch. And we've set up that the first 100 people that click to donate, Knotch will contribute the first $10. So the $10 is on us, and then you can increase your donation to any of your choice. We have split the charities in half, so GLAAD is on there. And then we're also adding some Black led organizations that are also available for you to donate. So please make a donation. And I am super excited to have Sarah Kate join us, not only as a leader of GLAAD, but also because GLAAD has partnered with Procter & Gamble to release some amazing marketing data around the power of Pride from a marketing perspective. And I think that is so interesting to our audience, primarily marketing audience, but also it really leads to how amplifying Black voices right now could really make a large impact when it comes to the Black lives within the queer community, based on your data. So I'm really excited to have you touch on that a little bit, but also share kind of your story as leader of GLAAD.
Well, thank you. And thank you for including me in this. I will say that I too came out in my job interview, and it's why I got hired. It was almost a requirement to be gay. So, and I come from 2 decades of media. I worked at Time Inc. and Condé Nast, and now run GLAAD as, and for those who don't know, GLAAD is the largest global LGBTQ advocacy organization, and we do our work through media. And there's a couple of things I want to say, and then I'll get to the research. One is that Stonewall was actually a riot, and riots are important, and our visibility has never been important. So when I hear queer people saying that they don't know how to celebrate Pride, your visibility is your lifeline. It has been our lifeline. Our community is Black, it's disabled. We have everyone. It's trans women of color. A woman was just murdered the other day. So it's really, really important that that we stand up, that we speak out, and that we show up as a community during Pride. This is the perfect platform to seed to our Black and brown brothers and sisters, and gender nonconforming folk. This is a really important month. It's never been more important. When you think about all the kids, like Garrison, you're from Mississippi. When you were in isolation there, can you imagine being locked at home as a little boy, knowing you're queer? And I don't know if you come from an accepting household, but there are many that aren't. It is such an important time for all of us who are queer or identify with the community to be out there, to be loud, and for companies to step up. Companies will be judged at the end of this month, they will be judged by what they did not do. And if they are not participating, that will speak volumes. And there are very simple ways to be more inclusive. I think that now that we have, that people are stepping up and talking about the intersectionality within our community, there's actually a flag that we have on our website, if you go to our website, that has Black and brown in the rainbow flag. Wave that flag. There's pieces of being inclusive, and that's internal and external, and then there's action. How are you giving back to the community? So I just wanted to do that little spiel because I think it's really important. I want everybody who's on this call, whether they're an ally or they're a part of the LGBTQ community, to be out there, especially if they have the privilege of a platform and the privilege of a voice, for those who can't speak up right now. Now, to get to the research, this will even encourage you more as marketers. So Mark Pritchard at P&G and I teamed up because we wanted to get to find out and really understand how LGBTQ representation in advertising affected non-LGBTQ people. So we did a piece of research, and it's general population, but we wanted to see the non-LGBTQ community in America. This is US based, how they felt about seeing LGBTQ people in ads. And so what we did was we asked obviously a litany of questions. First was, how aware are you? And most Americans are aware of the LGB community, less aware of the T. Some standard things broke out. When you started to get into demographics, the younger you are, the more aware you are of the trans community, the queer community. But what we found overall is that non-LGBTQ people appreciate the ads. They appreciate the inclusion because it educates them and it helps open their hearts and minds. And so we were blown away by this. Like, they want LGBTQ people in ads. So this is a permission slip for advertisers and for marketers to be inclusive. And then we, of course, wanted to know, so what do you think about the companies who include LGBTQ people? Do you see them as more favorable? Across every mark that we had, do you think they treat their employees with more respect? Do you think they give them better benefit packages? Will you buy from them? Across all measures, it was yes, 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 yes. They see companies who are more inclusive in their ads as better to their employees. They treat their employees with more respect. They treat their consumers with more respect, and they'll more likely to buy from them. And I have a whole presentation with numbers and all of that behind it. But I think what's really important here is that we focus on the fact that this is actually a permission slip. And what Mark and I felt were, so many advertisers felt like, you all were talking about the scared, right? Like, what'll happen? Mark talked about this, right? Like, being nervous to go out there. And then he followed up with, you're worse if you don't go out there, right? And so this is saying your non-LGBTQ people want to see LGBTQ people in ads. Now, what that looks like is important, very important. And so I will say this, we all said that you need to be involved, that you need to speak up and you need to stand up, and your actions have to to speak loudly. I always say, get your own house in order first. So, and there was quite a bit of talk about that. Make sure your policies are in place. Make sure you have the right D&I work being done. Make sure all of that is happening. Make sure your boards are starting to look diversified and that they have a pipeline. Make sure that your senior leadership, your entry level, the pipeline, all of that. Make sure that health coverage covers our trans brothers and sisters and anybody with disabilities. And then you can go out and market. But don't start marketing to our community if you are not recognizing our community within your own four walls. And then we're here to help too. GLAAD and all these people, I'm sure, Rachel and Garrison and Ryan, everybody, Jennifer, I know Jennifer, everybody's here to help you do the right thing and do it well. And if you make a mistake, and inevitably we all make mistakes, we're human, own the mistake and rectify it. Mistakes are natural. It's what you do with that mistake, that misstep, that changes the course. And so, but if you call us first, you won't make a mistake. And that's true when you're talking to marketing experts that we all are.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, one thing I feel like we talked about a little bit earlier, but, you know, there has been a conversation in the queer community about rainbow washing. I think for me specifically as a queer person, I see that and I understand it, but also I'm from Mississippi and I can't help but think about the queer kid growing up and the importance that a rainbow Oreo would mean to me, regardless of if it is just checking a box or not. Like, there is a power to visibility. And I think we see that in your data. And so I would love to hear a little bit on how you touch about that. I do agree that I think it can't just be a broad brush to the extent that the brand has to look internally and has to respond internally and has to do something. And I think we see that also with the Black Lives Matter movement. You can't just put out a statement. You have to donate. You have to fix your organization. But I would love to hear you talk on that a little bit, that kind of trend, because I do think that's something the queer community often brings up when it comes to pride marketing.
Yeah, you do have to be really careful about rainbow washing. And the queer community will call you out on it. That's the thing, is that we actually pay attention because there is an intense brand loyalty from the queer community if you participate with us properly. And by properly, I mean that you are walking the walk and talking the talk, not just talking the talk. And the community will call you out very quickly on that. I do agree with you, Garrison, that seeing, you know, a trans woman of color in the middle of Times Square last year in I think it was an Express ad, was jaw-dropping. And how many kids and people that affected is amazing. I'm not saying they're pink washing at all, because they're not. They actually do participate in the community. I think pink washing is, I always said, when I was in my career, earlier in my career, you know, when people talk about pink washing, and I didn't come out for the first, you know, 10 plus years of my career because I was working in media. I wanted to get ahead. I didn't want the fact that I was gay to become my brand, if you will. And I remember walking into Time Inc. And at that time they had like a gay out group getting together. And I thought, oh my God, I might be able to come out. Still took about 5 more years. I think it signals things, like you said. And I think it signals things. If I could have seen 15 years ago a pride parade like we saw last year in New York City, that changes your whole view on the world if you're a young queer person. But I think that what's most important is that you are participating with the community in a really true and authentic way.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah Kate Ellis, for joining us from GLAAD. And please consider making a donation, not only to GLAAD, but to all organizations that are fighting for the rights of Black lives specifically, but also the queer community. Just want to close out by saying thank you guys so much for joining us today. It means so much to me that I was able to put this panel together and ideate this crazy idea that I had. One of my 3 a.m. ideas that I somehow actioned and got my team behind. I appreciate Ryan and the rest of the Knotch team for helping me plan this. Just so you guys know, we do have a pros and content conference scheduled currently for June 24th and 25th. That conference is something we've planned year over year, but it is something that we are now expanding to also include the stories of other creatives, entrepreneurs, and people outside of just the marketing world. And we plan to share diverse stories and the power of diverse storytelling. So I will continue to share not only closing out Pride Month and how we did as a Pride, as a LGBTQ community and as marketers over the course of Pride Month, but also telling Black stories, trans stories, and other important stories at that conference. So please check out that for more information. We will also send out the link to donate in our follow-up email for all of you that attended, as well as ways to stay connected with all of our panelists via social media. So thank you to all my panelists. I appreciate you for joining us, and thank you all for attending. And happy Pride. You can still celebrate and honor Pride by acknowledging the fact that Pride is and always will be a riot. We will always fight for our rights. Visibility is important, and it is powerful not only to talk about Pride externally, but also internally. And so I hope those conversations are happening, and I hope that the Black voices within our community are finally being heard. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you so much, everyone.